Fairy Platinum Quick Wash. It cuts through greasy mess effortlessly. Fairy Platinum Quick Wash for an effortless clean.
Welcome back to Ireland AM. Now, September is Sepsis Awareness Month and aims to warn people of the condition that claims the lives of up to 3,000 people in Ireland each year.
Wow, that's such a large amount. Aisling O'Rourke lost her father to sepsis in 2020 and she's here alongside Dr. Michael O'Dwyer from the HSE to tell us her story. Good morning to the both of you. Aisling, if you can, tell us a bit about your father. We were just talking about him here during the break. He was 6'4".
He was 6'4". He was the kind of man that when he walked into a room, you noticed him.
Yes.
He was loved by his friends. And say that first off. He had a very good bunch of friends who really trusted him and he trusted them. He was one of these people who unfortunately worked far too hard.
Okay.
And learned that later in life. But yeah, he was just always this presence. You know, he was always there. If I was in town on a night out and walking home or walking to a bus stop, but he was always up late. So you'd ring him and say, listen, just keep me chatting here, make sure I'm all right. Yeah. So yeah, he was a character.
Yeah, the life of the party, you can imagine. And he was only 67 when you lost him to sepsis. Tell us a bit about that story.
So we had been minding Dad at home since 2018. He had a rare disease called AL amyloidosis. And he'd been doing really well. He was in remission, but he was weak. Like, there was no getting away from that. Yeah. And then that Friday, the 13th of November, because he'd been unwell, he was getting these regular B12 injections. So he had to go to the GP, and he said to the GP that morning, you know, I don't feel that great. And the GP said, you know what, go home, have a rest. But as the day continued, he began to feel progressively worse. So we called his medical team in the hospital and said something's wrong. And they said, bring him in. So I arrived home. Mum was with him all day. Mum and I cared for him over the 2.5 years in shifts. She did the mornings, I did the nights, and as a team. And so I arrived home and Mum was struggling to get him off the chair, to get him into the car. And that was new. That had never happened before. And so between the two of us, we got him into my car and I drove him down to A&E and drove right up to the door of A&E, which I know you're not supposed to do if you're not an ambulance, but I knew I had to get him out of the car. I had to get the assistance of the porters to get him out of the car. And for me, like, I think when you're a carer, you get really used to scares. You get used to, oh, all of a sudden the person goes downhill, but then they come back up again, you know? But the fact that he wasn't mobile was a real alarm bell for us. We arrived into A&E at about 5 o'clock. And I'll never forget, because it was November in Tullamore, we do this thing every year where there's a big party and Santa comes to town for the Christmas lights. Okay. And I remember Daddy saying to me, you know, Ava, my goddaughter, that she'd be very excited when Santa arrives, and he was looking forward to seeing that. He was going to go that year for her. And we arrived into the hospital. We had this lovely junior doctor, a Portuguese man, who kept Daddy talking about the rugby and the golf. There was an under-20s match that night. So between the doctor and the porter, they kept him updated on the score. Unfortunately, even though we now know that that doctor suspected sepsis, he was instructed to send Dad home with Augmentin. I would consider myself to be a very educated person. I've worked in media my entire life. I knew sepsis was bad. That's all I knew, but no one had mentioned it to us. Yeah. So we were sent home and we were told he had a minor infection, but you know, he'd had minor infections before. So we went home and we went to bed as normal, and 7:30 the following morning, the house phone rang, which nowadays is very unusual for the landline to ring. And my mum came to get me, and they had said that he should have been on a drip overnight, that there was an infection in the blood. Okay. And no one at this stage had said sepsis. So we asked then, well, how do we get him back into the hospital? Because we realised, he was fast asleep, but we realised then when the phone call came that we couldn't actually rouse him. And we physically weren't going to be able to get, you know, a 6'4" man out of bed without some assistance. So I called 999, and between the long and the short of it, we ended up with 3 paramedics on the morning, a paramedic car and an ambulance. I will forever be grateful for their kindness on that morning and their professionalism. They just really were unreal. Because it was hard work for them. So the senior paramedic at the time, when he examined Dad, he pulled me aside and said, Aisling, I'm sorry to say, I think this is sepsis. I'm now letting you know that we're starting sepsis protocol. Yeah. It was the way he said that to me, I knew it was bad.
It was serious, yeah.
Michael, we'll bring you in here for people watching the show this morning right now. What exactly is sepsis?
Yeah, sepsis is a really underappreciated condition. So it starts as a normal infection, but then the body's mechanisms to deal with that infection get out of control and enter this sort of vicious cycle where it starts to attack the body's own organs. And that's sort of an abstract concept, but maybe if you think of it, if you maybe cut your finger and get an infection in your finger, ordinarily the finger will get red, it'll get a bit sore, but then it'll settle down. You might need some antibiotics, might get better on its own. But then in the case of sepsis, those immune responses that are supposed to limit the infection to the finger start to spread throughout the body. And you start to get organ failure, you might start to get kidney failure, your lungs might start to fill up with fluid, your heart stops working properly. And it's that whole body response that's sepsis.
Now, I was just looking at some of the symptoms of sepsis, you know, temperature, kind of stiff neck and stuff like that. A lot of people might even experience that if they have a horrible flu at home, they're told to wait there. But what are some of the early warning signs? When should you start to call for help?
Yeah, so it's difficult. We have this problem in the hospital. It's difficult to pick up. It's difficult to diagnose. It's difficult to diagnose at home. We have a leaflet here actually that's been produced and has gone to all the GPs and the pharmacies that outlines the things that you should look for. And so because of that whole body response, it really can be anything. But if you look through, take sepsis sort of as an acronym, could you have slurred speech or confusion, and particularly in the older population, that might be the only thing that you'll recognise. You might have extreme shivering or muscle aches. People will stop peeing, stop producing urine, so if you haven't peed for 12 or 24 hours. Shortness of breath is a sign. People will tell you when they can tell you, I think I'm going to die. That's a frequent enough symptom. And then skin changes, like you talked about, mottling or a rash that doesn't fade when you press a glass on it. They're the type of things to look for.
And at that point, is it too late, or can it still be resolved at that point when you feel like that?
So no, it's not too late. Antibiotics is the mainstay of treatment.
Okay.
And the earlier you get antibiotics when you have sepsis, the better your chances are of surviving.
When Dr. Michael was listing all of that, you were here nodding your head to absolutely every one of them.
So how I liken it, because it's very complicated and it's very hard to remember those signs.
Yeah. And so detailed as well in what you were saying.
So like in 2018, Dad had a stroke in front of me. And I had grown up seeing the fast ads on TV, you know, the face, arm, speech.
Face, arm, time, speech time.
I didn't know that I had learned those off by heart, but apparently I had. So when he had a stroke in front of me, I was able to call 999 and say, he's having a stroke.
Yeah.
All I knew I'd heard people had sepsis, that they're very sick, or they died of sepsis, but I did not know, and that's my regret. I didn't know what the signs of sepsis were, and I didn't know the speed. Like we went from, like my dad was 67 years old, a big strong man. He went from feeling a bit unwell at 11 o'clock on a Friday morning, and he was dead at 2 p.m. on Saturday.
When the paramedics had said to you about sepsis and they were going to start the treatment, how long after that did your father pass away? You're talking hours.
You're talking about 5 hours.
And you
like Brian, like you might not remember the 6 sepsis symptoms.
Yeah.
But if you remember one thing from this morning, ask, could this be sepsis?
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that's the thing, because if you say, and especially for people caring for loved ones, you know that person better than any doctor, because you live with them at home. You know what
You're
they're normal.
You're an advocate for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So simply, if you end up in A&E with a loved one, just ask.
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid.
Aisling, thank you for joining us and
Thank
sharing
you
your
so much,
father's
Dr.
story.
Michael.
Thank you, Dr. Aisling, rocking the pink as well, and the shoes.
Yes. And for further information about sepsis, head over to hse.ie/sepsis.
Now we are back after this short break. See you in a few moments.